You ever play hide and seek as a kid? You know, the thrill of finding that perfect hiding spot, hoping no one would discover you?
Oh, yeah.
Well, today's deep dive involves a hide and seek game um, gone terribly wrong with a hidden player who never came out.
Wow. Hide and seek.
Yeah.
That's an interesting way to start this off. It really highlights just how quickly an ordinary activity can turn into a tragedy, you know?
Right.
Something as innocent as hide and seek. It's a thin line between a seemingly harmless game and a deadly situation.
Right. And the case we're exploring involves Sarah Boone and her boyfriend Jorge Torres Jr. in Florida,
Yeah.
and the chilling discovery: Torres was found dead inside a suitcase. Our sources are courtroom testimony and news reports, which lay out a story that's as bizarre as it is heartbreaking.
Exactly. And the big question the trial grappled with was intent. You know, did this start as a night of intoxicated fun that went too far? Or was there something more sinister at play? Was this a tragic accident, or did Sarah Boone intentionally murder Jorge Torres Jr.?
Okay, so let's unpack this. To set the scene, paint a picture of their life together and that fateful day.
Sure. Boone and Torres lived together in Florida. In the hours leading up to the incident, they were drinking, putting together a puzzle, even painting. Almost a picture of normalcy, which makes the eventual outcome even more disturbing.
Right, it's like a twisted version of the calm before the storm. Yeah.
Precisely. And then, according to Boone's testimony, they decided to play a game of hide and seek. Boone claimed Torres suggested he hide in a suitcase, almost as a joke.
Hold on. He willingly climbed into a suitcase. What kind of suitcase are we talking about here?
Yeah, that's a crucial detail. The suitcase was presented as evidence in the courtroom. It was a hard-sided suitcase, only 28 inches by 20 inches by 8 inches. The prosecution really drove home how small and confining that space was, making it difficult to imagine someone voluntarily staying in there for long, let alone being trapped.
Wow. I bet that had an impact on the jury actually seeing the suitcase. So Boone claims he got in willingly. Then what?
Well, according to Boone, their playful mood soured, and they started arguing. Eventually, she went upstairs to sleep, leaving Torres in the suitcase.
She left him zipped inside the suitcase. Didn't that raise any red flags for her?
This is where the story gets murky. Boone claims she doesn't remember how long Torres was zipped inside the suitcase before she went to sleep.
Wait, she doesn't remember. That's a pretty significant detail to forget, especially in such a strange situation.
Exactly. This memory gap became a focal point for the prosecution. They argued it was a convenient lapse in memory designed to cover up her guilt. They alleged that Boone intended to punish Torres, pointing to a history of arguments and infidelity in their relationship.
So the prosecution was already building a case for motive.
Yeah.
That there was trouble brewing in their relationship.
Right. And they hammered home the point that Torres was trapped. They called in experts who reconstructed the scene, explaining how the suitcase's small size and hard sides would make it impossible for Torres to escape. Couple that with the medical examiner's report, which concluded that Torres died from asphyxiation. Well, the prosecution's argument started to look pretty solid.
Asphyxiation meaning he suffocated inside that tiny suitcase.
Right.
That's just horrific. But was that enough to prove that Boone intended to kill him? What else did the prosecution have?
They presented video evidence that turned out to be very damaging for Boone's case. The videos showed her instructing Torres on what to say in court, seemingly coaching him on a story that would get her off the hook. They argued that this was evidence of manipulation and a conscious attempt to cover up a crime. They also pointed out inconsistencies in Boone's various accounts of the events, highlighting how her story changed over time.
So the prosecution was building a narrative of Boone being deceptive and vindictive. They believed this was no accident, that she meant to harm Torres. Did they have any specific evidence that connected her actions that night to a desire for revenge?
The prosecution alleged that Boone was furious with Torres for cheating and for past instances of choking her. They painted a picture of Boone as someone who wanted to inflict suffering, to get back at Torres for the pain he had caused her.
So we have the prosecution portraying Boone as a vengeful woman with a motive. What about the defense? How did they respond to these serious accusations? Did they deny everything?
The defense took a completely different approach. Instead of denying the events, they tried to reframe them, claiming Boone was a victim of domestic abuse and suffered from battered spouse syndrome. They argued that this syndrome explained her actions that night.
Okay, for our listener, can we break down what battered spouse syndrome actually is?
Of course, battered spouse syndrome is a recognized psychological condition that can develop in individuals who have been subjected to prolonged domestic violence. It's characterized by a range of symptoms like fear, helplessness, and even a distorted perception of reality. The defense argued that Boone's actions, while undeniably tragic, were a direct result of the trauma she had endured at the hands of Torres, a desperate act of someone trapped in a cycle of abuse.
So instead of a cold-blooded killer, the defense was presenting Boone as a victim herself. But did they provide any evidence to support these claims of abuse?
They focused on Torres's alleged history of abuse, arguing that he was the one who was controlling and manipulative. The defense argued that he voluntarily got into the suitcase, that Boone didn't force him, and that she never intended for him to die. They pointed to Boone's expressions of love for Torres in the past, claiming that these demonstrated her true feelings for him, and that she wouldn't have deliberately hurt him.
So two completely different versions of the same event. One portrays Boone as a manipulator who wanted to punish Torres, and the other paints her as a victim reacting out of fear and trauma.
Yes, and remember that the jury had to consider all of this. They had to decide which narrative was more credible, more likely to be the truth.
Right. That must have been incredibly difficult, especially with such strong emotions swirling around the case. Before we get to the verdict, I want to talk about one piece of evidence that I know had a huge impact on the courtroom. The video Boone recorded while Torres was trapped in the suitcase.
Right. This video was a turning point in the trial. It showed Torres struggling to breathe, begging Boone to let him out of the suitcase. It was incredibly disturbing to watch.
I can only imagine. It must have been agonizing for Torres' family to see that.
It was. One of Torres's family members had such a visceral reaction to the video that they actually ran out of the courtroom in distress.
Wow. That speaks volumes about the raw emotion that permeated this trial. Did this outburst have any impact on the proceedings?
Boone's attorney actually made a motion for a mistrial because of it, claiming the family member's outburst might have prejudiced the jury against his client. However, the judge denied the motion and the trial continued.
So despite the drama and the two very different versions of events, the jury ultimately had to decide. Guilty or not guilty, what was their verdict?
The jury found Sarah Boone guilty of second-degree murder.
Wow. Guilty. That's a serious charge.
Yeah.
For the listener, can we clarify what exactly second-degree murder means in this context?
Sure. Second-degree murder means that the jury believed Boone's actions led to Torres's death. But they didn't believe it was premeditated, that she didn't plan to kill him beforehand. It suggests a level of intent, but not necessarily a carefully orchestrated plan. This is different from first-degree murder, which requires premeditation, or manslaughter, which often involves a crime of passion without malice aforethought.
Okay, that clears things up. How long did it take them to reach this verdict?
Less than 2 hours.
2 hours. That seems incredibly fast for such a complex case with so much conflicting information.
It does, but it might indicate that the jury was largely united in their decision. They must have found the prosecution's arguments and evidence to be much more convincing than the defense's claims.
So what happens next for Sarah Boone?
She's scheduled to be sentenced on December 2nd. She faces a minimum sentence of 22.5 years in prison, but the judge could sentence her to life.
A potential life sentence for a game of hide-and-seek that went tragically wrong. So for you, what's the most striking element of this case so far?
It's the conflicting narratives, you know? We have two completely different versions of reality, each backed by its own evidence and arguments. It highlights how perception and personal experience can shape our understanding of events, making it challenging to determine the ultimate truth.
Right. And it adds this whole other layer to the case, the psychology of domestic violence. We're not just talking about a physical act here, but about the lasting emotional and psychological effects of abuse.
Exactly, and that's what makes this case so compelling. It's not a simple open and shut case. It raises tough questions about intent, responsibility, and the impact of trauma. It really gets you thinking.
Absolutely. Stay tuned for part 2 of this deep dive, where we'll continue to explore these questions and the broader implications of this case. This case really makes you think about accountability, especially when you factor in the dynamics of a volatile relationship. It's hard to separate the alleged abuse from the events of that night.
It's a tangled web, isn't it? On one hand, we have this tragic outcome, a man losing his life in such a bizarre way. And on the other, we're forced to grapple with the complexities of domestic violence, the potential for past trauma to influence actions, and the question of whether Boone's actions were a form of retaliation or a desperate act of self-preservation.
Right. And the jury ultimately decided that her actions constituted second-degree murder. But a big part of the defense's case was Boone's claim of battered spouse syndrome. You think that resonated with the jury at all?
It's hard to say for sure what went on in the jury deliberation room, but the fact that they reached a guilty verdict relatively quickly suggests that they might not have found the battered spouse syndrome defense convincing enough to outweigh the prosecution's evidence. Remember, the prosecution presented a strong case, emphasizing the physical evidence, the inconsistencies in Boone's story, and those damning videos.
Yeah, those videos were pretty hard to ignore. But let's play devil's advocate for a moment. What if the defense had succeeded in swaying the jury? What if they had secured a not guilty verdict?
That's a fascinating hypothetical. If Boone had been acquitted, it would undoubtedly spark a massive public debate about the role of battered spouse syndrome in criminal cases. It would have been a very controversial verdict, with strong opinions on both sides.
I can imagine. Torres's family would have been devastated.
Yeah.
And there would likely have been a public outcry with many questioning whether justice had truly been served.
Absolutely. It would have brought up a lot of complex, legal, and ethical questions about how we as a society handle cases where domestic abuse is a factor. How do we balance the need for accountability with the recognition that victims of abuse may act in ways that are difficult to understand from an outsider's perspective?
Right. It really underscores the immense responsibility that rests on a jury's shoulders in these types of cases. They have to weigh so much conflicting information, trying to discern the truth amidst all the emotion and competing narratives.
It's a heavy burden, for sure, and it highlights the human element at the heart of our justice system. Ultimately, it comes down to 12 individuals interpreting the evidence and the law to make a decision that will have profound consequences.
And through all of this, it's so important to remember that Jorge Torres Jr. is the true victim in this tragedy. He lost his life, and his family is left to grieve and cope with this unimaginable loss.
Absolutely. It's easy to get caught up in the legal arguments and the courtroom drama, but we can't lose sight of the human cost. A man is dead, and a family is shattered.
And what about Sarah Boone? Regardless of the outcome of her sentencing, she's going to have to live with the weight of her actions for the rest of her life.
That's a heavy burden to carry. It makes you wonder about the possibility of rehabilitation for someone in her position. Can someone who has committed such a violent act truly find redemption? Can they heal from the trauma that may have contributed to their actions?
Those are big questions. And it makes me think about the ripple effects of this case. This isn't just about Sarah Boone and Jorge Torres Jr. It sheds light on the broader issue of domestic violence, a problem that affects countless individuals and families, often hidden from public view.
It's a stark reminder that domestic violence can happen anywhere, to anyone. Regardless of their background or social status, it often happens behind closed doors, making it even more difficult to detect and address.
And it's not just physical abuse either. Domestic violence can take many forms: emotional, psychological, financial. It can be a pattern of controlling behavior that wears down a person's sense of self-worth and autonomy.
Exactly, and that's why awareness is so crucial. We need to recognize the signs of domestic violence, both in our own lives and in the lives of those around us. We need to create a culture where people feel safe to speak up, to seek help, and to break free from these toxic relationships.
It's a call to action for all of us to be more vigilant, more understanding, and more proactive in addressing this critical issue. We can't just turn a blind eye to it.
I agree completely. Silence only perpetuates the cycle of abuse. By talking about it, by shining a light on this darkness, we can hopefully start to create a safer and more supportive environment for everyone.
So connecting all of this back to our listener, why is it so important for them to care about the suitcase trial?
This case, while incredibly tragic, offers a valuable opportunity for reflection. It encourages us to examine our own relationships, the way we communicate, and the choices we make, even in moments of conflict or stress.
It's a reminder that actions have consequences, and even seemingly small decisions can have a profound impact on our lives and the lives of others.
Yes, and it urges us to be more aware of the subtle signs of domestic violence. We need to cultivate a culture of empathy and support, where victims feel empowered to come forward and seek help.
This case goes beyond just a courtroom drama. It's a reminder that we need to be more attentive, more understanding, and more proactive in creating a world free from violence and abuse.
Well said. And it leads us to our final thought-provoking question for today. If you could rewind time to the moments leading up to that fateful night, what advice would you give to Sarah Boone and Jorge Torres Jr.? What could they have done differently to change the trajectory of their story?
That's a powerful question to consider. It really challenges us to think about the potential for intervention,
Mm.
for recognizing warning signs,
Hmm.
and for making different choices.
Yeah, it does. And it highlights the interconnectedness of our lives.
Yeah.
How our actions, even seemingly insignificant ones, can set off a chain of events with unintended
It's
consequences.
like the butterfly effect, right?
Mm.
One small flap of a butterfly's wings can create a ripple effect that leads to a hurricane on the other side of the world.
Exactly. It underscores the importance of mindful decision making, open communication, and seeking help when we need it, both for ourselves and for those around us.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the suitcase trial,
Hmm.
what are the key takeaways you want our listener to walk away with?
I think the most crucial takeaway is the need for greater awareness and understanding of domestic violence. It's a widespread problem affecting countless individuals and families, often in silence and behind closed doors.
And it's not just about physical abuse, as we talked about. Domestic violence can take many forms, including emotional, psychological, and financial abuse.
Right. It can be a pattern of coercion and control that erodes a person's sense of self and their ability to make independent choices. It's vital that we recognize the signs and understand that resources are available for both victims and perpetrators.
We need to foster a culture where individuals feel safe enough to come forward, seek support, and break free from these destructive cycles. No one should have to endure abuse in silence.
Absolutely. And while this case is undeniably tragic, it also reminds us that even in the face of immense pain and loss, there's always hope for healing and positive change.
That's a hopeful thought to hold on to. This has been a truly insightful deep dive. Thank you for guiding us through this complex and emotionally charged case.
It's been my pleasure. And to our listener, if you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, please reach out for help. There are resources available, and you don't have to navigate this alone.
That's important. Remember, it's okay to ask for help, and there are people who care and want to support you. Until next time, keep diving deep, keep asking questions, and keep those conversations going.